We have a big update for the City of Arches this week. We're going to look at Battle Walker from the Abyss by David Hartlage. I'm going to talk a bit about the idea of starting with the story and what that actually means. And we're going to cover the first batch of June Patreon questions from the Sly Flourish Patreon. I'm Mike Shea, your pal from Sly Flourish, and I am here to talk to you today about all things D&D on this D&D talk show. This show is brought to you by the patrons of Sly Flourish. If you enjoy this show and you like what you're seeing and you want access to all kinds of exclusive material like the City of Arches and a lot more, you can do so by becoming a patron of Sly Flourish, and you can find the link to that in the show notes below. So let's talk about the City of Arches. City of Arches is a product... I'm at the wrong spot. The City of Arches is a small city sourcebook that currently is available to patrons of Sly Flourish. And it is right now a 27-page document. It is growing every month. It's growing by 5 pages, this month alone. It is a city built for adventure, a almost limitless city of adventure. It has at least 3 different ways you can kind of expand it in all sorts of areas. One is it is very deep. There are many ancient chambers and ancient things below the city. There's also the catacombs above the city, huge, vast caverns and catacombs and tunnels and passageways and stuff in the mountains above the city. But most of all, it has these things known as the archways, these very ancient, unstable portals that can connect to other worlds. On occasion, creatures come through the portals, often nice. Often their memories are scrambled when they come through. So you might find a horned devil who is actually working at the local baker's shop, because it turns out that rather than flaying people with his spiked chain, he prefers to bake fine breads. So you see a lot of that kind of stuff. It is meant to be a city built for adventurers of all different kinds, all different races. It makes sense that they're all here, and there's lots and lots and lots of places to go. So every month I add a few pages to the City of Arches. I expand it in little ways, and over the past few months it has expanded quite a bit in a lot of areas. It has maps by Chloe Beland, and 2 different kinds of maps, an overview map and a side view map, which I'll show. And it talks about everything. It talks about the politics. It talks about how it works. It talks about the keys to the arches. It has notable NPCs. It has lots of locations. And every location, almost every place in the book has a hook that you can use to generate a small adventure. So lots and lots and lots of adventure hooks all over the place. This is one of Chloe's maps. This is a side view map of it that kind of shows how deep this place can go, how vast it can go. So just the surface level of the city is only one part of it, but there's all these chambers below. And so I've got little descriptions of all of these places. So lots of locations, as I mentioned. Here's the overview map of the place. So very, fun, comfortable place to live in and be in, but lots of adventure taking place below. Notable factions, different groups that are operating in and around, random events that can occur here. I have this section that I added last month called the Worlds Beyond the Arches. These are the worlds that might exist beyond those archways. There's 10 of them, descriptions about what they're like, what's going on there. So if you want to throw some lore when the characters are exploring the city themselves, or actually have them see or have a dream sequence or actually travel to one of these worlds, you can do so. It sort of expands it in many areas. I have a 1-page player's guide you can print out and give to your players if you plan on running an adventure in the City of Arches. That includes factions and patrons and things like that, the 6 truths. I have a quick adventure generator built on the tables from the Lazy DM's Companion that help you build adventures here. If you want to just kind of randomly generate a small adventure, you can do so with the random adventure generator, fill in all kinds of things. I have an introductory adventure, first level adventure called the Obsidian Skull. Very small, straightforward, meant to be played in a couple of hours adventure where you learn a little bit, just go fight some cultists, learn about the city. And now we get into some of the things that are brand new. So the concepts of a Hexflower comes from Goblin's Henchmen, and uses their Hexflower cookbook. The idea behind it is, and I talked about this on a previous show, so you will find a link to exactly how a Hexflower works before, but essentially it's random. It's a random table that remembers its state. Essentially, when you have a random thing, you move into a spot, and then your next random roll is from that spot. So that way you have common things that might be below and rare things up above, and you can kind of move around. So we use this in the City of Arches by it's just a toy, really. And the toy is really like, how are the different areas of the City of Arches connected? And what passages might the characters find as they're exploring? So I have this scenario that you're hanging out in the public baths and there's a big whooshing sound and you essentially get flushed down through the cisterns of the baths and end up in different places. And you can kind of roll 2d6 to determine where you might end up as you flow through here or as you explore the area. It's a one-page guide, kind of neat. Sort of a fun thing. But then here's the real big meat that got added this month, and that is a full campaign arc. The idea here is if you want to run a longer campaign, in this case, a 1st to 12th level campaign in the City of Arches, what is an arc that you could follow for the campaign? And so this whole summary is about a particular powerful item known as the Key of Worlds. This is a key that supposedly can open up any of the gates in the City of Arches and connect them to any of the worlds that they connect to. Very, very powerful item. Very dangerous item. The wrong person having access to this could take over the world. The right person could have something else. And the idea is there's this group that used to control this key. They weren't sure they wanted to destroy it, as powerful as it was. So they sealed it up beneath the City of Arches. Lore is just beginning to come to light about where this thing might be. And the characters are sent by a mage, Danvin of Duskwater, to say, go find this key. Learn where it is. We want to get access to it. He wants to learn about it because he's a historian from the Tower of the Arcane called Kartan. But he doesn't know it, but his apprentice, who's probably not on screen, his apprentice is actually also trying to get a hold of the key and is sending rival adventuring parties to go get them. So, and then this mercenary group called Lisbeth and Rose, the Grey Dawn sisters, are the mercenary group that is going down there to try to get a hold of these keys as well. So this is a very location-based campaign arc. You travel down into all the various locations. You find out where, you find out what it takes to unlock the vault that holds the key. That requires lighting 2 fires in 2 different spots, I think, or 3 fires in 3 different spots, but the rival company might light one of them. So you travel to all these different things. You light these fires. You have to have a special item in order to light the fires. You light the fires, that opens up the vault door. You go to the vault, you open up the vault, you go in and you get the key. And so it's, 1st to 13th level adventure that can take them through. And each section of the adventure is sort of broken up into major sections. So we have like this introductory adventure called the Scroll of Legend, where you just find out about what's been going on. Light in the Darkness is about learning where the vaults are, learning where the vault is and learning where the fires are and what you need to do them. And then you have this section of the Blackfire Braziers, going to each of the 3 braziers. The characters get to decide which brazier they're going to go after. And you can decide, do you want them to just do it on their own and there isn't a rival adventuring company, or you want an rival adventuring company, you can add that in. You light the 3 braziers and then you end up at the Vault of Worlds itself, and it gets very, very dangerous. You're fighting Balors and Hezrus, Glabrazos and Mariliths. Really powerful stuff. Eventually getting a hold of the Key of the Worlds and then deciding what to do with it. Do you destroy it? Do you throw it into the ether so that nobody will ever find it? Do you hang on to it? Do you use it? Those are all the kind of things. So meant to be kind of a fun thing, meant to be a fun campaign arc that a DM can read. If you want to run, if you like the City of Arches, you're like, this is really cool and I want to run this. This gives you a good guide for how to fill out your adventure. You would still fill out the locations and add your monsters and do the adventures the way you want them, but it gives you a general outline about how to do this. So this 4-page adventure, 4-page campaign arc is the main new addition and the main reward for the Sly Flourish patron this month. So if you want to check that out, it is available now. If you are a patron of Sly Flourish, you can go to the City of Arches. You can find it. It's in the list of all of your rewards. You click City of Arches. It'll pull up this PDF. It has all of this stuff in it. I'm also going to announce it to patrons in a couple of days. I think either Monday or Tuesday, a note is going to go out saying, hey, this is the new update to City of Arches. But it's already been updated. So if you're watching this and you are a patron, you can go get it right now. So that is the City of Arches and the new additions, the Hexflower and the Key of Worlds adventure arc. Today, we're going to preview an adventure written by my friend David Hartledge. David writes for the blog DM Dave, and he just talked about like the inspiration for the battle for Battle Walker from the Abyss. So he writes all kinds of wonderful and beautiful articles about D&D. Dives really deep into this game that we all love. And it's one of my favorite blogs that talk about D&D. Fantastic blog, and you should definitely subscribe to it. You should definitely read it regularly. It's a wonderful, wonderful blog. And look, when Mike Shea distills his Lazy DM Prep Man, look at him. I didn't even know he was quoting me in this. That's very funny. So anyway, he sent me a review copy of this. So the copy that I received, I did not pay for myself, but I did read it, and I think it's really cool. So David put together Battle Walker from the Abyss. It is a 26-page adventure designed for levels 17 to 20. So this is as high as you can get, right? And the idea of writing, there's an intimidating plan, right? Writing an adventure for 17th to 20th level characters is very hard to do. I have done it, and it's very hard to do. But there's one key thing that David did that I think makes this work, which is playtesting. He has playtested it. He talks about in his article here about what he had to go through to make this adventure. And it was hard, right? He said he ran it and it didn't work, right? And he had to go back and he had to fix a lot of it. So he talks a lot about his inspiration. This is an article he's got on his blog. This is the one I had read before, why I took the high dive into the shallow end of the D&D pool. So he wanted to make an adventure for high-level characters. He knew how hard this is. He knew it's a tough thing to do. And he talked about how he ran it and the first couple of runs didn't work. He pitched this, I think, and the pitch didn't go through. But he went back. He persevered, right? He went back. He play tested it. He ran it. He went through and figured out why it didn't work. And the result of this is the adventure, which you can buy right now, Battle Walker from the Abyss. You can pick it up for $5 on DriveThruRPG. Or I'm sorry, $5 from the DM's Guild right now. So cheap adventure considering the amount of playtesting and editing that went into this thing. Nice clean layout, pretty straightforward layout. Very, very readable. Clearly, he's read through it a bunch of times. And the adventure follows something that I believe strongly in, which is making sure that the theme of the adventure fits the level of the characters. They're not just going to a nearby castle and fighting an evil king, right? They are going through a pit into the abyss and going to a level of the abyss. They have multiple paths they can take. One interesting thing about this adventure is it's not a super linear adventure. This adventure splits off into different areas that it goes to, so into different paths. And I think even the ending, if I from my skim read, I think the ending has multiple paths to the ending that they could take, multiple final battles that they can take. I think you can end up fighting both, but I think that you can choose which of the endings you go for. But all through my reading of the adventure, it definitely read like it has a really firm grasp on the kinds of adventures that high-level characters are going to run. It has maps. I think he's got, some color maps of the areas. I think these are all available as battle maps. It's got nice artwork, fun artwork. Yeah, there's a cool map that he laid out. Really fun, cool adventure. And there's a fair bit of criticism so it's 26 pages, but includes like the stat blocks for all of these creatures. And again, he's gone through multiple rounds of playtesting. I think if you read the article, it talks about how he had to simplify some things down because they're just too hard to operate. And it's just hard. And I'll be straightforward. I think even when you playtest this thing, different groups of high-level players, high-level characters, operate significantly differently from one another, depending on what kind of characters they are, depending on the experience of the players, all kinds of things. So I have no doubt, and I think he even said that there are options in here for increasing and decreasing damage or dealing with, so he has these scaling things, right? Strong scaling. While restrained by webbing, the creature takes 18 force damage at the start of each of its turns, right? So he has kind of different ways to scale the adventure up because you really need it. This is something we also did in Fantastic Lairs, that at high levels, it's so swingy that the DM really needs to have big dials they can turn to make sure that the threat of a situation meets the threat that you would expect it to have in the world. David learned the same thing and put it into this adventure. So there's been a fair amount of criticism, I don't know. Some people have criticized 5e in particular, D&D, and because they don't have enough high level stuff. They're like, every campaign adventure, none of them reach 20th level, except for, I think, Dungeon of the Mad Mage, I think is the only one that goes to 20th level of all of the published hardcover adventures, right? And they're like, there needs to be more high-level content. So if you believe that, here's an answer, right? Here is high-level content. Here is a 17 to 20th level adventure that you can run. So very cool. Yeah, one of the first modules I ever bought was Queen of the Demon Web Pits, says Infobro. And yeah, it reminded me of that. It reminded me of the big walking spider ships. I'm sure Spider Battle Walker, I'm sure was influenced by the idea of Queen of the Demon Web Pits, which is the same thing. When I ran a high-level 4th edition game, I had Loth's big spider ship in it. It was really cool. So that is Battle Walker from the Abyss by David Hartledge. You can pick that up on the DM's Guild. There will be links to that in the show notes below so that you can pick it up, check it out in the show notes below. $5, very cool. If you're interested in high-level adventure, I definitely recommend checking it out. So that is Battle Walker from the Abyss. So I wanted to take some time today to talk about something I've been thinking a lot about. A lot of times when I hear a situation or I hear sometimes people struggling with a situation, when I hear people that are asking how things work, my immediate answer is, I don't know. How does it work in the story? Right? That when you want to know, like, well, how do I design a good trap? You say, well, how would that trap work in the world? If you say, I want to know what kind of encounters I should run in this goblin cave, you say, well, what kind of things are going on in the goblin cave, right? What's happening there? How many goblins does it make sense for? I talk about this a lot in Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. There's a lot where we talk about situations and things like that. But I think it's worth diving into because I get the feeling that it's almost a platitude at this point. That when you say start with the story or you say go with the fiction, that it's hard to understand exactly what that means. And there's so many different ways to sort of approach a D&D game that if you are just saying something like start with the story, like what does the story tell you? And I remember because in the 4th edition days, I had an opportunity to talk to a D&D developer about, it was Chris Sims, right? And I was talking to Chris Sims about encounter building. And I asked him, like, what do people need to know about encounter building? And he said, the important thing to remember about encounter building is that it starts with the story first. How does the story work before you figure out what the encounter does and making sure you have the right controllers and the right lurkers and the right strikers and the right, all the right challenge related. You want to say, like, what is the adventure of? And I didn't understand it at the time. I didn't really understand what he was talking about. I was like, that's not how D&D works, right? D&D, we build encounters. We know the characters are a certain level. We know what kind of encounters they should face for that level. We know that we need to have a mix of different kinds of creatures so that you don't have everybody just, one type of creature. We know you need an environmental effect. And I started with design. For a long time, for almost all of 4th edition. I don't think it was really till I started playing other games outside of D&D even that I understood, like, oh, how does that work? Of course you start with the fiction. The mechanics represent the fiction. And I've heard D&D designers say this over the years. I've certainly said it over the years, but it's a hard concept to get your mind around. And I think the first thing that we have to kind of recognize with this is the balance of realism and fun. This is something I've talked about too in various areas. There's sort of 2 things that guide the design of something when you're thinking about it from the story. And one is, what would it actually be like in that world, right? How would it operate in that world? What kind of monsters make sense for that situation? Given the situation, like, how would the villains act? What would they do? How would they protect themselves? All that sort of thing. And you generally want to focus on trying to make the world feel as real as possible, making it feel like a living place. Events occur when the characters are there or not. That, people wander in and out, right? And so you start with that. And this is where I think, like, you go with realism as much as you can. This is my thought, right? And I'm sure there's different approaches. So you start with trying to build as realistic a world as you can. But then there's this other angle that you want to consider, which is that fun? The stuff that we're doing that's realistic, is that fun as well? Is that bringing joy to the game? Is it making it interesting? Is it making it fun? Or has realism become, from a gameplay perspective, a bit of a slog, right? Or just not fun, right? And that's when you say, okay, now we're going to bend realism a little bit. Maybe we change realism. Maybe we change the situation to try to lean in towards fun. So these aren't equal dials. It's not, you don't have 2 things and you make them both true. You really start with realism, I think, first, right? You try to build it as realistic as possible first. And then once you've got it, you look at it and say, is that fun? And if it is, great. And hopefully it is, right? But sometimes it might not be. Now, so what's an example of this? An example would be the Sahuagin lair in Ghost of Saltmarsh. So Ghost of Saltmarsh, the final enemy, you go into this old temple that used to be lizard folk. I think it used to be lizard folk and now it's Sahuagin, right? The Sahuagin sunk it. And if you read the adventure has like piles of Sahuagin in lots of different spots. You go into a chamber, there's 7 Sahuagin. You go in another chamber, there's Sahuagin brutes and other Sahuagin. And one thing is you say is, okay, like you start with, okay, well, there are a lot of Sahuagin flying around in this temple, floating around in this temple, swimming around in this temple, right? There's a lot of Sahuagin there. But the realism is they're moving from chamber to chamber. They have guards to make sure that nobody's invading, but beyond the front doors are probably not worried too much, right? And the fun aspect comes with, like, if the characters go into a chamber and there's 7 Sahuagin there and they get a big fight with a bunch of Sahuagin and it goes on for a while, a while being 18 to 24 seconds, right? Which is like how long combat takes. And they have that battle, then they swim down another chamber. It's possible they could go to that other chamber and face another 7 Sahuagin, right? And from a situation standpoint, that situation might be, equally likely to any other. But it's also potentially likely that there's only 2 Sahuagin, right? That there's not a lot of Sahuagin there. And that's when you say, it might be more fun if there's only 2, because they just fought 7 Sahuagin. It'd be a slog if they fight another 7 Sahuagin. And this is when you get into that idea of attrition, right? Combat attrition. I still read about this, and I still read players and people talking about the idea of the importance of attrition, the importance of like when a character goes into a dungeon, it's up to you to make sure they spend their resources crawling through that dungeon and not just having the opportunity to rest all the time, or imbalances the game. Wizards have too much of a priority because they use long rests a lot. If you give them a lot of long rests, wizards are going to be more powerful than everything else. I'm not a believer in that philosophy, right? I think the situation should determine where they can rest. I think the situation should determine lots of things. Again, there's that dial on fun though. Start with the situation, determine these things. So my point is that instead of worrying about like, oh, I can take away a lot of their resources, I'll just give them 3 separate fights against piles of Sahuagin, one right after the other. Is that fun? I argue it might be more fun if they fight a big pile of Sahuagin and then they go to the next chamber and then there's 2 Sahuagin having tea. I don't know how you have tea underwater, but right? Right? And now you have an opportunity for role play. You have an opportunity for intimidation, capturing, other questions that come up. Do we try to swim around them and avoid them, right? So you build a different situation that's approached differently from the previous one because that's what's fun. But the realism is still there. It still makes sense that there'd be Sahuagin there, but it's kind of equally likely that there'd be 2 as opposed to 7. Why would there be 7 in every chamber, right? So that's where you want to look at the situation and start with what makes sense for the situation. What kinds of creatures would they have here? And then what's fun, right? What also makes that fun? And so that's that whole, that to me is the balance of realism and fun. You start with realistic, within reason, right? They have bubble tea made with real bubbles. Exactly. I like to think that you try to make the situation as realistic as possible for what you think would happen in the world. Of course, with all of the fiction of the world applied, right? Magic exists and things like that. And then fun. An example of like realism where it might not be as fun is I remember I had some characters that were going through the Tomb of the Nine Gods, right? A dungeon built by a Sararak. And every time they saw a lever, they're like, I'm going to use Mage Hand on the lever. And I'm like, the counterweights on that lever make it 20 pounds to pull. There are tight levers. You can't pull it with Mage Hand. And they're like, why is it that every stupid lever in this place is so heavy you can't use Mage Hand? I'm like, well, guess who made it? A Sararak. You think a Sararak doesn't know about Mage Hand? You think when he's building a trap or a death trap dungeon specifically to screw with people, like that's why it's designed, that he's not going to do that? Or alternatively, you can pull the lever and it kills you over on the other side of the room, right? Like a Sararak is a smart dude, right? He knows about Mage Hand. So he's not going to put things in place that Mage Hand can be affected by a single cantrip because he's an archmage. He's one of the most powerful liches, right? So that's when we think like realism, and you describe that, and the players are like they'll begrudgingly like, right? But that's realistic. Is that fun? I don't know. It actually might be more fun if a Sararak screwed with people who used Mage Hand, or some of them did work with Mage Hand, but not in the way you expect, right? Things like that. So that's that idea of realism and fun. So then like, where does this whole idea of starting with the story, going with the fiction, where does it come up? Where does it help? Where do people not, in my experience, reading stuff, reading people's experiences, talking to people about it, where does that not apply? I think a big one is in encounter building, right? I think a lot of times in encounter building, people start by thinking about what they need to challenge the characters before they think necessarily about what monsters are there. If you go to like Kobold Fight Club, like let's do it right now. I can't remember the URL ever since they changed it, right? There we go. And we say we're going to have 5 8th level characters, right? And we say, hey, let's make a hard group. And we say random, and we refresh it. And it's like we have a Kraken Priest and 5 bards, right? Now, obviously, this is like the extreme end of a non-situational based thing. But like, what possible sense does it make for 5 bards to be hanging around a Kraken Priest? Given that we don't have anything about our situation. We don't know anything about it. So this is kind of interesting. Right? Boss with minions, right? Young white dragon and 7 gray oozes. Any environment. We will say, we'll go with aquatic. All right. And now let's try it. So this one's a little bit better, right? A Kutoa Archpriest and 9 giant seahorses. Okay, at least by environment we got it. A water elemental Myrmidon and 5 giant octopuses. Octopi? 5 giant octopi. I guess that would work. 5 giant octopi seems a bit extreme. We picked boss with minions. Let's say duo monsters. Let's find out. A giant shark and a Kutoa archpriest. That's not so terrible, right? A giant crocodile, a water Myrmidon, and a Kutoa archpriest, right? Look, and I hit reload and it keeps doing the same ones because there's not that many. There's not that many that fit that challenge rating. What if I do a deadly fight? A Myrmidon and a Hydra. My point with this is that sometimes we start with what I think I need the encounter to do from a gameplay perspective before we're thinking about what makes sense for the story. And there's a reason why in Return of the Lazy Dungeon Masters, in the 8 steps and stuff like that, I don't have a section where you build encounters. I have a section where you select monsters, right? And you pick all the different kinds of monsters that might make sense. And my thought is the situation is evolving. During the game, then you choose which monsters make sense. The one difference with this would be boss fights. With boss fights, I think it's worth spending some time to actually build a boss fight. I talk about this in Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master as well. But generally speaking, per encounter, I think it's more fun to say like, well, what is the previous encounter like? What was the next encounter like? What makes sense for the situation? And then we choose our monsters. But the monsters that you pick for that list, that's where you say what monsters make sense for this place. And it could be pretty random. It could be they're in a dungeon, an old dungeon. My point in this is that when we're building encounters, I think a lot of DMs start with designing the encounter as a mechanics process and then wrap the story around it afterwards. They might build an encounter. They might look at like what monsters make sense. They might look what monsters make sense from a challenge rating perspective. Maybe they consider environment. And then they build their encounter around that. And then what you end up with is a game where like each block of encounters is sort of its own thing. I like to think of this like Gears of War. If you've ever played the video game Gears of War, you will walk into an area and you'll immediately tell, oh, I'm going to have a big fight here. And it's because I see the environment is set up a certain way. I see that there's places for me to do my slam up against the wall thing. I can tell. You can just walk in and immediately tell there's going to be a fight here because of the way the environment is set up, right? And that's because the game is essentially built up from these like battle environments, right? And I played this way for a long time with 4th edition. And I'm not saying it's wrong, right? Like if, again, right, the core rule, if you and your group are having a good time, go with the gods, right? Like, it's who's for me. I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong. I'm offering an approach, right? And the approach that I take is you build a more dynamic, more, a changing scenario. A scenario that can change, both because the story is evolving, things are happening in the game that are changing, but also you can change it to kind of fit the pace and the feeling of the game. If you know you don't have a lot of time left, you can run something small, or you can step outside of combat completely. But a lot of that all comes from what makes sense from the story. What can evolve inside the story? How does the story change? What monsters make sense from here? How are they operating? Why do they operate here? And then how does that work? And that's, again, it can be tricky. And like I was talking with some friends of mine and we're saying like, sometimes you just have a cool miniature, right? And like, you're like, hey, look, like I got my new basilisk miniature from Dwarven Forge, right? It's got glowing eyes. Oh, look, how many miniatures you see that have glowing, look at the pulsing, glowing green eyes, right? So I'm like, I want to make an adventure that has this guy. And you're like, okay, that's cool. What's this guy's story? And what's the story that surrounds him? And what's the story of the other things that might appear there? And how does it affect everything else? Because you could just say, I've got a cool basilisk. We're going to have a basilisk lair. Well, now you've created the story around him, and that's cool, right? And you can still decide what's the lair like and why do they go there and what do they want to have. That's where you can come at it from different angles. Like I remember Dave Chalker said, like, I build adventures sometimes just because I have a cool map. And you're like, that's great. Like we can be inspired. Our adventures can be inspired from anything. It can be inspired from a miniature. It can be inspired from a map, a piece of artwork, a monster where we just like the mechanics, right? And we like, I want to try that monster with those mechanics. That inspires the story that we can build, right? The way the story comes about can come from any place. But once we start to think about that story, then we say, okay, well, now how does that operate in the world? What is that like? What kind of creatures would be around a basilisk? What, does he have a secret cult of worshipers that worship the basilisk who all blind themselves, right? They all wear like things over their heads, right? Could be cool. Different things can kind of inspire our story. That's when we want to think about like what makes sense for the story. So it's not necessarily like only one angle. Like you're only starting with the story. You're never allowed to look at your cool basilisk mini and say, I'm using that. No, the story can be inspired from anything, right? You can get inspired from anything, but eventually it still turns around into this story. And it's a story that builds that. And that's one of the things that I think makes the story so cool is this idea that it drives towards building a situation, right? That the most fun adventures that I've run, the ones that I've enjoyed the most, both playing in and running, are the ones that are situation-based adventures. You have a location, you have a goal. The characters have a goal for why they're going to this location. Get the chalice, right? Go pick up the chalice, right? This magical chalice that once belonged to the town. I mean, we'll steal right from like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. There's an old, ancient, evil temple. There is a chalice that some cultists stole from the town and brought to the evil temple, which they're using to resurrect a demon. So now you got a situation. And the characters have been hired by the town to go to the temple to recover the chalice and bring it back to town so that the town can be healthy again. That's the goal, right? Go get the chalice. And that's the background story. We have a location. We have this old, ancient, evil temple, right? Maybe it's been around for 1,000 years. It's got all kinds of stuff. You want to go rich? You throw some history. Wow, who built it? What did they build it for? Was it actually a prison where it was trapping the demon, but the cult is actually using it to release the demon that was trapped there? Maybe, right? So you can build your history around it. And then you say, okay, what occupants are there? And I always like to think of two different kinds of occupants. I like to think of like your main group, like the evil cult, and they've hired some mercenaries that are there too. So they've got physical brutes that are protecting them, and they've got like their evil priests who are doing their crazy ritual, right? And those are like the intelligent side. Then I like to have a non-intelligent side. There are secret caverns that haven't been opened in the thousands of years, and there's all kinds of crazy monsters in there that nobody has seen before. And there's different entrances that you can take to get in. Do you want to go in through the old passageways that haven't been uncovered in a long time that only the old man at the village knows about? Or are you going to go kind of through the main entrance? And then now you've got a situation. You've got an evil cult. You've got non-intelligent, bestial kind of monsters. You've got a place. You've got a goal. And you put it in front of the players. And you say, here's the situation, right? Here's the situation. Here's the goal. What do you want to do? And they could say, we're going to pretend to be mercenaries. We're going to be augmented mercenaries. We're going to break in. We're going to say, hey, we're from Grey Company, and we're just hired by those nutty priests that are worshiping the demon to come and help them. And the guys are like, oh, okay, go, yeah, welcome. Go to the buffet. The buffet's pretty good today, right? And then they break in, they get on their way in, and then you have to figure it out. It's almost like running everything like a heist. They can go any path. And then the other group says, we're never going to make it trying to go in through the front door to pretending mercenaries. Let's go through that old river tunnel that the old man told us about. And we know that there's stuff back there. And then you go and there's giant spiders and there's crazy basilisks, right? With glowing eyes that turn you to stone. There's monsters you have to fight, but then you get in through an angle that no one thought of, and you can get right to the throne room because there's like a waterfall in the throne room, and you can come down the waterfall and you can fight the cultists and you grab the chalice and get the hell out. Situations, right? The story is building that situations. I didn't talk about number of monsters. I didn't talk about encounters. I didn't talk about, all the mechanic-y kind of parts of that, difficulty checks and all that. I'm thinking big picture, right? But I know I can go grab a Dyson map. I can list some monsters down that I can pull right out of the monster manual. I got pretty much everything I need to make an adventure. I just made that up while we're just here talking. When I talk about, building from the story or building from the fiction, it part of that is like, what is the situation that's going on here? How does it evolve? How will it evolve? What happens when if the characters are making their way in through the bestial side, but it's taken them a long time, what's changing inside the dungeon itself? What's changing with the ritual that they're doing, right? Again, always having that other dial on in the back of your mind, what's fun, right? What's fun, what's cool? Determining rests. Right? This is another area where a lot of people say, like, how do you make sure that you are not giving too many rests, that characters aren't taking too many rests? I had somebody who posted a really interesting Reddit article where somebody came up with a solution for this problem. And the solution was an interesting one, which is safe havens. And I'll have to find this article again. If I find it, it will be in the show notes below. I'll persevere to find the thing about safe havens. And the idea about safe havens is that you have only certain locations can you actually take a rest. I think of this like Final Fantasy, right? If you're playing in a Final Fantasy game, it's like you're going through a dungeon. You can't just rest in the middle of a dungeon. You can only rest where there's that little star, right? And when there's a little star or pool or whatever, you can go to the star in the pool, and that's where you can get a rest. And that way, the designer knows how far the characters can get before they're going to be able to get a rest, right? And a part of the safe haven is you can't just rest in the wilderness, right? You can rest in town. You can only rest in a place where you can really rest, where you don't have to worry about facing off monsters that are out there, where you don't have to worry about setting up watches, where you don't have to worry about, when there's no stress, right? You're fully protected. There's no stress. then and only then can you take a rest where you get all of your abilities back, right? And short rests, I assume, are a little easier. And then one of the things I thought was interesting is Lehman's Tiny Hut doesn't count, right? And I'm kind of good with this because Lehman's Tiny Hut is a little tricky. Lehman's Tiny Hut is a good place to be able to get a safe haven, and you can certainly take a short rest there. But it's too stressful not knowing what's happening on the outside, or not, or you're still not in a safe place, and so you can't take a long rest in a Lehman Tiny Hut, which is a pretty big nerf of the Lehman Tiny Hut because that's what it's designed for. I get that it's not great. I'm not a fan, but that was what it was designed for. Right. So InfoBro says there's an optional rule in the DMG like this. There's an optional rule in the DMG that short rests are 8 hours and long rests are a week. But I think it just changes the time. I don't think it changes the location. Now, obviously, you're not going to spend a week hanging out inside of a dungeon. But yeah, there is that too. So first of all, my answer to a lot of this, and when you think about like, how do I manage rests inside of my dungeon, is to say, well, what makes sense for the dungeon? Right? If there's a room that no one has been in for 1,000 years and they can seal it up and make sure nobody remembers this room and there's no other things at play, does it make sense that they can't rest there? Not really, right? Does it make sense if they're really worn down and they really need a rest and they're in the 4-way hallway right before the boss? Does it make sense that they can rest in the 4-way hallway? Probably not. Not with the bosses right one door away and not with people wandering through the hall. So a lot of times you can look at the situation and say how what kind of rest you can have. But one of the things that I like as a DM is I like to think of rest as an element of pacing. I like to know that I can change the dial on rests. I want to be able to give them rest when they deserve it or when it makes sense. Like I've had it where the characters burned everything out of hit dice, out of spells, out of their abilities, and they're just about to get to the boss. And I'm like, this is a big boss fight, right? And I get it that like, oh, that's ideal but do you really want them fighting a boss with nothing but cantrips, and no healing spells and nothing else? Not really. Like you'd like them to have something. So I try to find a way for them to be able to take a rest, whether it's like hey, there's that old goblet that's in this old room that you didn't find. If you drink from the goblet, it gives you the equivalent of a long rest, right? Or something, even at least the equivalent of a short rest and recover some spell slots. I like to have a dial on the rests so that I can offer to them. But there are many times where I just don't care. And most of the time when I don't care, it means they're getting rest all the time. So what? Does it really matter that much? If they're going through the wilderness, I don't have to challenge them when they're going through the wilderness. They can just find a situation because I don't care about pushing them to their limits, right? I care about having a fun, enjoyable, interesting story. And so that could mean that if you have a wilderness, sometimes their wilderness encounter isn't combat. The wilderness encounter is meeting somebody or seeing that some other big monster had come through here, learning something. To me, the real fun, this is something Numenera is teaching me a lot too. The fun of it is learning stuff, right? Learning about the situation, evolving the situation. Combat's awesome. I love combat. I love running combat. I love being in combat when I'm playing. I love all that stuff. But I don't have to worry about like, oh, is it too easy? If they face all this stuff and they have a full rest and they've got all their capabilities and they know it and they're like, we're going to burn all our spell slots. Is that really a problem? I don't think so. I'm not too worried about it, right? I think where I worry about challenge is usually in making sure that the feeling of a boss fight feels hard, feels challenging, right? That you want that cinematic style of being on the ropes but still managing to pull it off. And that's why I'm a big believer in the dials, because I want that pacing to feel like that, right? And my thought is, even if you have a full rest going into a boss fight, if I have multiple waves of creatures in a boss fight, you're still going to burn all your resources because you're still going to fight 3 encounters worth of monsters, right? And because I like doing that for boss fights. So, I mean, that again, when I look at rests, I ask myself, what makes sense for the story? And sometimes the story is, you're really not going to find any opportunity to take a long rest in this dungeon because the psychic energy of this place is so disruptive. You don't think you're going to be able to easily find a place to rest. But then there might be one room where that psychic energy isn't there. And that's the one room they can save. That's that idea of like putting the Final Fantasy star that says, oh, here's okay. And you can move that room where you want it so that you can change up the pacing of the game. You can control it, right? I don't expect that my opinion on this is the majority or that it's certainly the opinion of everybody. I have a feeling lots of people have different opinions on this. And if you've got some and they're working for you, and that's great, right? And share your experiences, right? Share how it works well for you. But I know that this is working for me too. And I've talked to other people and it's working for them. So I think that this is another approach where you might think about like, it's like there's so many things to worry about. And I think worrying about rests. I don't think we have to worry about that idea. I keep hearing it come up about the number of ideal battles per day and everything like that. And if you're off that, it's not that big a deal. It's really, in my opinion, it's not that big a deal. Traveling through the wilderness, I talked about too, right? Go ahead and, still you can share stories. What's the situation? What's going on? But I don't worry about it. So then there's this idea of like aiming the lens. So when we're thinking about the story of our game, some of that story is where we aim our lens, right? Is it tight and focused? Is it wide? Is it time? How do we treat time? Is time fast? Is time slow? And when I talked about like dungeon crawling, I think in previous episodes of this, I've talked about dungeon crawling. And there's that question of like, do you track turns in a dungeon? Do you worry about how long a torch can last? Do you worry about your rations and when they're going to run out? Some people run that way, and that's very cool, right? And if it's working for you, it's working for you. That is an example of like where you're putting the lens, right? And sometimes you want the lens to be fast and furious and focused on the action and things are happening, the situation is big and lots of things are going, and sometimes it's more fun to focus down on the details and really get that right. I play in a game every other week. My friend Chris runs a D&D game, and one of the things that was kind of fun for me is my character was kind of pretending to be a mentor to another character about what it's like to go traveling out in the wilderness. And he talked about things like make sure to take your socks off every few hours and floss your toes with the socks so you don't get the weird fungal crud, right? And that's like a lens, like that's a pretty tight lens, right? Like that's not a big part of the story, right? The whole thing is like her mother disappeared and there's a whole other evil queen who's trying to go after her because she's got some power that she wants, right? And there's this much bigger thing at play. There's a huge war going on between the orcs and the humans and all this stuff. And still I'm like taking up time in the game talking about the toe flossing, right? And it's fun for me. I think it's fun for the other players. I don't know. It's kind of, she plays off of it, so that's kind of fun. One of the big fun things is I talked about like, washing clothes and everything like that, and the importance of like, that you got to worry about the fungus. And then it turned out she had prestidigitation, and she was secretly like cleaning her clothes with prestidigitation all the time. I'm like, we've been traveling for 7 months and you have prestidigitation and you didn't tell me? Like that was fun, right? So that's where like you can focus the lens sometimes, and you got to think about where does that lens focus that is bringing the most joy. You could think of it like a director of a movie, right? What angles do you want to take? What focus? How much time do you want to spend on this? When do you want to jump cut to the bigger action? Because that's really the cool part, right? Big thing on pacing. I complain about Adventures League adventures sometimes where I'll have DMs that run it and they spend a lot of time on the middle of the adventure and then they cut off the end of the adventure, right? Because they're like, oh, you only have 4 hours and you only have 15 minutes left, but you're facing the great big black dragon. I had this actually happen. You're going to face a big black dragon. We're just going to say you beat it. And I'm like, you made us do this giant slog through this swampy part with skill checks and skill challenges and number of successes versus number of fails and exhaustion and all this other nonsense that was totally not fun, right? We spent 45 minutes on that. And then we get to the part where you get to fight a black dragon and we don't have enough time, right? That's the lens, right? You got to look at it and be, how much time do I have? And where do I want to be focused in that lens? And do I want to narrow it down? Do I want to expand it? The big part. What does that have to do with like starting with the story is that's kind of the story, right? That when the story's not happening when you sit down and you plan your game, it's happening when you're running your game. And you want to think about when you're running your story, when you're thinking about the overall story of the game, how tight do you want that lens? How big do you want that lens? How fast do you want time to be going? How slow do you want timing to be going? Where do you want to put the detail, right? Where do you want to put the detail? Where do you want to, hand wave stuff? And it's all tied back to what makes the game fun. What are we enjoying, right? And what makes the story interesting? To me, the details of things like flossing your toes with your socks every few hours made travel feel more real to my character, and it was kind of a fun interplay between my character and other Cecilina, the other character, right? It was a fun thing, so I enjoyed it, and I think everybody else kind of thought it was cute and funny, right? So that's tight lens, right? But it was kind of a fun thing. Where are the lens? And sometimes like that, in that case, the player will tell you. The player will show you what kind of resolution they want. If they go into town and they get real detailed, you might say, okay, they want the lens to be a little tighter. Now, of course, you have different players with different goals and different things that they want. And that's tricky to balance too. That's a whole other topic. But I think that's that. So this is, I've been kind of all over the place. I recognize that. But I think like, when I'm talking about, when I say things like, start with the story, build from the fiction. That's kind of what I'm talking about. I'm hoping I clarified that a little bit. I'm hoping that I added some practicality to that idea. But let me know, right? If you're reading this and we're talking about scenes and situation and story and stuff like that, and you're not getting it, let me know. You can tell me in the comment, ask me in the comments. If you're a patron, ask me in the Q&A. That'd be awesome. And we can try to figure this out together. But that, I want the idea of focusing on the story or story first stuff to not just be a platitude, to not be just something that we say, but nobody actually knows what it means. I'm trying to knock that down and break that down into here's specifically how that plays out. And here's the difference between that and other styles. Not because it's better. It's just a different approach, but it's an approach that I have enjoyed. It's a style where my style has changed significantly over the past 10 years. And one that I greatly enjoy. I love it. It makes me so much happier as a DM to watch the situation evolve, to not know how things are going to go, to play off of what is happening, and to always have the dials ready to be able to make the game fun. So I hope you enjoyed that. Let's do some patron questions. Every month I post a thread on the Sly Flourish Patreon where patrons can ask questions. I answer all of them on Patreon. Some of them I highlight here on the show, and other ones become articles or videos in later things. So let's take a look. Brooke says, what are the best ways to hook players into adventures without making it feel forced or repetitive? I find myself defaulting to have them be attacked, and I want to change it up. I'd also like to avoid overusing the random NPC ask for aid trope. Yeah, good question. So this is like, this is about hooks, right? How do you draw players into your adventures? And there's a few different ways. There are some where it's like models, right? Like what are the quest models that you can use? What are the different ways? The cold open is one of them where the characters are thrown right into the situation. I did this in Eberron. They're walking along and all of a sudden a train explodes, right? Or one of the rails explodes and they get involved because they're on this rail thing. There's lots of different cold opens that you can use. Here are some of the ones that I've used that were pretty interesting. One was grave robbers dig you out of a charnel pit. You've been there for 1,000 years, but yet you still appear to be immortal. Like you appear to be normal people. So they're digging up your grave to steal your stuff. You wake up. How did you die? Why are you there? That's a pretty thematic one, right? I did that for a Shadowfell based game. So I wanted that would be like a really good Domain of Dread style game is you were dug up. You don't know why you were resurrected. You don't know how come you weren't dead. All of a sudden you just wake up coughing and a bunch of grave robbers are there and they're going to try to kill you because they're like, hey, we still want your stuff. Right. So that's one angle. Another one is starting off in an arena, right? I had it where a character got hit in the face with an axe, got critted, and was down to 0 before they even did anything else. They start off in the arena. We rolled for initiative. Guy hit him in the face with an axe. Out of the Abyss starts with you captured by drow, right? You are sitting you're prisoners inside of a drow camp. Spoiler, right? But it's very, very scene. Those are like cold opens where you just throw them right in the middle of the situation, right? And some of those are better than others. Like, you want to make sure your characters are on board with this idea of how things are going to start and what kind of game is going to go. I don't think I did it a little bit with those. I hinted at it, right? But I don't think I told them exactly how it was going to go. So those cold opens are one way to draw somebody in. The idea of like you are guards, the Fandelver, right? The beginning of Fandelver, you're guards on a cart. It's going across. You get attacked by goblins, right? And it turns out those goblins have kidnapped somebody else. That, it's fine, right? Like one thing is we don't have to be too... I don't think we have to look at it and be like, I got to constantly shake the model, right? I don't think you have to. Like D&D is D&D. There's a reason why we like this game that's been around for 50 years. And it's because we like some of those tropes. We don't mind the models. Oh, a guy comes to the inn and hires you to do a job. The quest board, right? The Dragon of Icespire Peak has a quest board. Nothing wrong with quest boards, right? That's a good way to do it. But some other ways, the group patron is one that I really like. The idea that all of the characters during character creation are tied to a particular patron, and that patron has a job for them to do. Right. My Numenera game began with them falling in a sinkhole into an ancient ruin and then had to make their way out of the ruin and learning things about the ruin. That was mostly to learn the mechanics. It didn't really draw them in the game, but it was certainly an adventure. I think so. The Lost Temple of Tmoshan, one of the D&D adventures has you start off having fallen into a pit and have to make your way out of the dungeon. That's certainly a good way to go. So, but group patrons are like a gift that keeps on giving. You can design it around the characters. You can have relationships between the characters and the patrons. So it's not random NPC asking you for aid. It's your uncle asking you for aid, right? You and your uncle asking you for aid. So having a group patron and then asking the players how their characters are tied to this patron or to each other is a good way to go, right? And the patron is the one that's hiring them. I think that's a really easy, really good model that works a lot for generating is who do they work for, and doing that during your session 0, right? So during your session 0, you can decide who the patron is. In my Eberron game, they had an uncle. One of the characters was the nephew of a patron, and the patron was the one who was like, hey, look, our family needs to solve this problem, right? And you're my nephew, and you need to do it. You and your friends need to do it, right? That worked really well. It was very, very strong. So those are a few ideas. Brooke, I hope that answers your question. Dom G says, I'm planning a sci-fi campaign that puts the PCs in the middle of some big and powerful star empires. I love big star empires. I have a good handle on the organizations, i.e. what different empires want and how they go about it, but I'm getting stuck thinking about the lower level NPCs that the parties will be interacting with. How do I keep the NPCs from just being generic stand-ins for their larger organizations? So I think the answer is Herald. I love Heralds, right? And the thing about Herald, a Herald is a NPC that works for a faction, right? And sort of represents that faction. And if you're trying to make sure they're not generic, I mean, random tables can help you. Random personality types, random races, random characteristics that they have. You can sort of make them different ones. You can also say well, they're an NPC, but they're actually secretly working two organizations against each other. The NPC doesn't have to be directly from one of these empires. They could be working two empires across each other. But yeah, you're on the right track. The one thing that you're on the right track of is thinking about how you can put interface elements into your game that your players are going to directly interact with that are going to relate to these empires like NPCs, right? So that already is good. But you can think about, having one notable NPC and then build NPCs like you would pick a cool character from fiction that you like, give them a neat name, switch genders if they're clearly let's go Al Swearingen from Deadwood, right? Al Swearingen, but a woman, right? Very, change these things, kind of change their appearances, change their, pick their styles and mannerisms and decide how they operate in the world. So really the question is, how do you make interesting NPCs instead of generic NPCs? And random tables are a way. Picking character archetypes is my easiest way, and building interesting NPCs, and then having them be the heralds to the organizations. They're the ones that kind of speak for the organization, or maybe multiple organizations, right? Or they're working directly against one of the organizations, and have the characters learn about the organizations through those NPCs. But of course, you're also talking of, fronts, right? We've talked about fronts before, the idea of villains, big groups that are operating, and they have a goal and they have steps. And the steps that they take, those steps are the things that the characters are going to see. They're going to see that organization is moving somewhere and doing something, and it's doing something because it's doing these things. So, Dom, I hope that helps answer your question. Cloaker says, you and Brandis' recent Monsters of the Multiverse observations about the future game becoming an AC arms race versus NPC spellcasters feels incredibly valid. I love the quick reskin tech tip to DC saves of 8 plus the attack bonus. This is the sort of forward thinking we're going to need in the months to come. What are another couple of systemic current edition or 5.5 problems on the horizon that might be ripe for similar intuitive solutions so DMs can mitigate these potential future design pitfalls? So I don't think it's a pitfall, right? When I look at the design of the monsters from Monsters of the Multiverse, I think they're better than the monsters that we've had previously. I look at the War Priest, right? I really like the War Priest. Let's pull up the War Priest. Right? The new War Priest is really solid, right? Hits hard, easy to run, not a huge stat block, and yet is really effective, right? Still has things that make it feel like a priest. So I don't think the design is worse. I think the things that, the little tips and tricks, I don't want to keep repeating the same stuff, but the little tips and tricks that help us run any monster are going to help us run these. Now, part of your question is, how are we going to mitigate it with 5.5 coming forward? I don't know what 5.5 is going to look like. I don't think anybody does. I don't even think the people working on it know exactly what it's going to look like, right? I would not be surprised if they're looking at the feedback of Monsters of the Multiverse to determine how they're going to do monsters in the new monster manual. Maybe. I don't know, right? I don't know what it's going to look like. So I don't have any answers about what that's going to be like. So what that means, I can only look at what we have today and back and ask myself, what kinds of things do I need to do now to look back? And I think another good heuristic tool, so we have these little tricks that we keep in our heads, right? And a little tool that I like to keep in my head is understanding how many hit points and how much damage any monster at any challenge rating generally should do. And I built this model looking at what Paul Hughes had done with Level Up Advanced 5e, but also on his blog, the Blog of Holding. He did a lot of the math to figure out what generally do monsters do, right? And some of a couple of the numbers that I like to keep in my head, all of these numbers I think are in the Lazy DM's companion too, but you can memorize them. And one is that the hit points of a monster is roughly 15 plus 15 times its CR, right? So, I think that might even be a little high, but that way, if you have a CR 10, it's 165 hit points, right? If you have a CR 5 times 10, 50, 25, 75, 80, 90 hit points for a CR 5, right? So you can quickly say okay, the CR 5 that I'm looking at, are its hit points significantly lower or higher than I would expect given its CR? And that doesn't mean you have to change it. you might still go with the hit points that are listed in the monster manual, but it gives you a gauge of like, is this significantly less or higher or lower than the kind of hit points that I would expect? And you can do the same thing with damage, right? When I look at a monster, I say, how much damage does it do? What's its damage output? And that's usually 7 times level, 7 times CR, right? So a CR 10 should be doing about 70 points of damage overall. A CR 5 should be doing about 35. And this comes up because there are certain creatures. I was looking at, so in my experience, there are some creatures of lower challenge ratings in the newer stuff that hit way harder than that, right? Way harder. And then there are some creatures at higher CRs that do way less than that, right? And that's where having that number in mind can give you an idea of what might I have to do when I'm going to run this creature. And an example is I'm running a battle on Wednesday. So we're going to look at Tome of Foes. Nope, that's not right. That's Legacy. We're not looking at Legacy. We want to look Monsters of the Multiverse. And we're going to look at the Wizards, because I think it was the Wizards. Now, Wizards you would expect are a little glass cannon-y, right? And I think there was like a CR6. Is it this guy, the Conjurer? No, it's one of the other ones. The Enchanter, right? And I'm like, okay, the Enchanter is a CR5, right? And I'm like, okay, that's challenge rating appropriate. Right? Hit points are a little low because it's 50, right? And I said 75. So clearly its hit points are low. Armor class is also low with a 12. And it does not have shield or anything like that. So it has no way to knock that. It has a 15 AC, but it doesn't have anything that goes higher than that, right? So its hit points are definitely low. But then damage output-wise, Enchanter makes 3 arcane blast attacks, right? Plus 6 to hit, 19 psychic damage. That's nearly, what is that? 57 points of damage at CR5? Right? So to me, 5 times 7 is what? 35? Do I have that right? Yeah, 5 times 7 is 35, right? So this guy's doing almost twice as much damage as I would expect it to do. So if I'm running this guy and I say, oh, he makes 3 arcane blasts and he's going to go blast that guy, you take 58 points. And like 58 points, I have 40 hit points, right? Like, yep, you're down. So that's when you want to kind of know, is this guy actually, like, he's going to have fewer hit points than the CR, but he's going to have way more damage than the CR. How is that going to operate when I run it at the table? It's a little unfortunate that a creature like this is so swingy that you need to ponder that idea, that you need to not just look at its challenge rating, but also look at its damage output. I've already had to do that high challenge monsters a lot. But now at lower challenge monsters, I have to be like, is this really high? Because like I think even the original Monster Manual Mage hit pretty hard. The straight Monster Manual Mage is CR6, and it's pretty tough because it hits Cone of Cold, which I think is 36 points of damage against multiple targets. So I'll tell you what, that Enchanter Wizard is cool, and that's if he blasts 3 different people, right? And that's when you go, okay, if I wanted to hit correctly, I am not going to bone one character, it would be mixing up the attacks. It would be throwing 3 different ones at 3 different targets and hitting each of them for, 19 points of damage. That's pretty severe because, I think the CR is about the same. Right? Low hit points, but bam, Cone of Cold is brutal. Like, greater invisibility, Cone of Cold, right? That's a hell of a combo for the regular mage to be able to do. And that Cone of Cold is probably going to hit multiple characters, but it's going to hit for 36 points. That's what makes mages really dangerous. They can hit a lot of people for a lot of damage, but they generally don't knock down lots of people because they're spreading that damage across multiple targets. So little tricks like that. I think having those numbers in your head, what is the general challenge rating and damage output in monsters? The other one that I like to keep in mind is roughly how many hit points can I expect a character to have? It swings wildly, so I know that my math is not correct, so you don't have to correct me on my math. But generally, what I think it's 7 times level plus 3 is roughly the average. Now, things like toughness change it, so higher levels it probably goes up. But 7 times level plus 3. So if you have 5 characters and they're 5th level, you can generally expect that the rough amount of hit points that the character has is, 43 hit points? No, 38 hit points, right? 38 hit points at level 5. I think that's about right. 7 times 5. Math is hard. I think it's 35, right? Yeah, 35. So 7 times 5 plus 3 is 38 hit points. So you keep that number in your head, like level times 7, right? Is about the amount of hit points you can expect a character to have. Some will be lower, some will be higher. Your crazy barbarian with the con, with an 18 con is like more than twice as many because of resistance and stuff like that. But generally speaking, you can play that out. So little numbers like that. If you want like a listing of these numbers, the Lazy DM's Companion has that. I think in the beginning of the book has descriptions of these numbers that you can keep in your head that help you understand the mechanics behind the game. So you can build things quickly on the fly, but you can also benchmark the things that you've got. Cloaker, I hope that answers your question. I want to thank everybody for hanging out with me today. I hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you for letting me rant about the story focus of D&D. I hope that was helpful or interesting, or at least gave a different perspective on things. If you enjoyed this show and you want to help me out, you can do so in 4 ways. You can subscribe to the Sly Flourish newsletter and get weekly articles sent directly to your inbox. You can join me on Patreon and get access to things like the City of Arches. You can subscribe to my videos here on YouTube, so you'll get notifications when new videos come out. Or you can pick up any of my books, which are filled with all the stuff that you've seen from today. So thank you all very much for hanging out with me today. Have a great day, and get out there and play some D&D.